Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
The jaw opens. Pike was not a castle meant to be taken. It was a defiant, ugly fist of stone thrusting up from the churning sea, connected by swaying rope bridges that defied sanity. To reach the inner keeps, an army first had to break the curtain wall, a massive, curved bulwark that guarded the headland. For 3 days, the royalist forces had thrown themselves against it and bled. But tonight was different. Tonight, King Robert Baratheon was not trying to win a tactical victory. He was trying to put on a show. The night sky over the Iron Islands was usually pitch black, swallowed by storm clouds and freezing rain. Tonight, it was lit in hues of hellish orange. Thoom. A massive trebuchet, dragged all the way from the riverlands and assembled in the mud, unleashed its payload. A boulder the size of a wagon, wrapped in pitch-soaked rags and set ablaze, arced through the sky like a falling star. It smashed into the upper battlements of the gatehouse, shattering stone and sending screaming Ironborn tumbling into the darkness below. Again, King Robert roared. He stood at the very front of the vanguard, a behemoth in dented plate armor, the great antlered helm upon his head. He didn't care about the arrows raining down into the mud around him. He didn't care about the iron bolts thudding into the wooden mantlets of his siege engineers. He was completely, gloriously in his element. Give them fire. Robert bellowed to the ranks behind him. Give the squids a taste of the sun. Beside him rode a madman. Thoros of Mur, the red priest who had become Robert's favorite drinking companion, wore a faded red robe over his chainmail. In his hand, he held a longsword. With a wild, cackling laugh, Thoros ran a piece of rough leather down the length of the steel. The blade erupted into brilliant, roaring flames. The fire burned with a fierce light, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the terrified Ironborn defenders looking down from the walls. "The Lord of Light commands you to burn," Thoros screamed, raising the flaming sword high, spurring his horse forward into the muddy killing ground before the gates. "The stag commands it too," Robert roared in unison, hefting his massive warhammer. Thousands of men from the Stormlands, the Westerlands, the Riverlands, and the Vale surged forward. They beat their swords against their shields, creating a deafening, rhythmic thunder that shook the ground. Desperate, screaming men dragged forward siege ladders. Battering rams carved from whole tree trunks were rolled toward the iron-reinforced oak of the main doors. On the walls of Pike, chaos reigned. Balon Greyjoy had stripped every other tower and keep of its defenders, rushing every available man to the front curtain wall to repel the massive, seemingly suicidal assault. Archers fired blindly into the mass of men. Men-at-arms hurled rocks, boiling oil, and curses. The noise was absolute. It was a cacophony of shattering wood, ringing steel, and dying men. The attention of every single soul within the fortress of Pike was locked entirely on the front gate. Which was exactly what Ned Stark had planned. On the far side of the island, where the sea chewed relentlessly against the sheer, vertical cliffs beneath the great keep, there was no fire. There was no shouting. There was only the darkness, the howling wind, and the crashing surf. At the base of the cliff, standing on a jagged, slippery shelf of rock barely wide enough to hold them, stood 21 shadows. Benjen Stark looked up. The cliff face was a terrifying sight. It was a sheer drop of nearly 200 feet, slick with centuries of moss, sea spray, and bird guano. The rock was dark and unforgiving. Above them, the stone walls of the great keep seamlessly merged with the natural cliff, creating an unbroken vertical line that disappeared into the pitch-black sky. The waning moon offered no light. They were operating by touch and instinct. "Ready," Benjen whispered. His voice was entirely swallowed by the crashing of a wave against the rocks, but the man next to him nodded. Willem, the captain of the Wolf Guard, was adjusting his harness. It was a strange contraption, designed by Lord Ned himself. Thick straps of boiled leather wrapped around the thighs and the waist, buckling tightly at the center of the chest. Attached to this harness were thick coils of braided hemp rope, and a series of heavy iron rings forged with spring-loaded clasps. They wore no mail, no plate, only soft, dark leather and thick wool. Their boots were soled with a soft, grooved leather designed to find friction on wet stone. Their weapons, short swords and long daggers, were strapped tightly to their backs or thighs to prevent snagging. Benjen carried red rain, but the Valyrian steel blade was bound tight in a dark leather sheath to hide its crimson pommel. "We climb," Benjen commanded, signaling the men. Willem went first. He reached up, his chalk-coated fingers finding a small, jagged fissure in the rock. He pulled himself up with a terrifying, smooth display of upper body strength. He found a footing, braced himself, and pulled a heavy iron piton from his belt. Using a muffled iron hammer wrapped in thick cloth, Willem drove the spike into a crack in the stone. Thwack, thwack. The sound was entirely masked by the roar of the sea below and the battle raging miles away. He clipped one of his sprung iron rings through the eye of the piton, threading the main line of rope through it. The ascent began. It was a slow, grueling process. The Wolfguard moved like a chain of spiders, following Willem's lead. Drive the spike, clip the ring, pull the body upward. Find a handhold that felt like razor blades, dig the soft boots into a depression no wider than a coin, and push. Benjen was the fifth man on the line. He didn't look down. He knew the freezing, violent death that waited in the black waters below. He focused entirely on the stone in front of his face. His fingers were already bleeding, the rough granite tearing through his calluses despite the chalk. His forearms burned with a deep, searing ache that begged him to let go. Breathe, Benjen told himself, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second, his face pressed against the cold, wet rock. He pushed his awareness inward. The burning in his muscles dulled to a distant ache. His grip on the stone became absolute, his fingers locking into place like iron clamps. They reached the halfway point, 100 feet of empty air below them. The wind suddenly shifted, hitting the cliff face with a violent, freezing gust that sought to peel them off the rock like dead leaves. Above Benjen, the fourth climber, a 16-year-old boy named Tim, made a mistake. His boot slipped on a patch of black moss. Tim panicked, overcompensating by lunging upward for a handhold that wasn't there. His fingers scrabbled uselessly against smooth, wet stone. With a muffled, terrified gasp, Tim peeled off the wall. He fell. The safety rope tied to his harness snapped taut, pulling violently against the iron piton Willem had driven into the rock above them. The piton groaned. The rock around it, fractured by centuries of ice and salt, shattered. The spike pulled free. Tim plummeted, falling past Benjen in a blur of dark leather, his eyes wide with silent, absolute terror. He was going to fall all the way to the rocks below, and his weight would likely rip the men below him off the wall as well. Benjen didn't think. He reacted. In the space of a heartbeat, Benjen drove his right boot deep into a narrow crevice. He shoved his left forearm into a crack, twisting his bones to lock himself into the stone. He poured every ounce of his energy into his center of gravity, making himself as heavy and immovable as the cliff itself. With his free right hand, Benjen lunged outward. He didn't try to catch Tim's falling body, he caught the safety rope whipping violently past him. The sheer, violent force of a falling human body hitting the end of a slack line should have ripped Benjen's arm from its socket or torn him cleanly off the wall. When the rope pulled taut in his bare hand, the friction instantly burned through the tough leather of his glove, searing the skin of his palm. But Benjen did not budge. He gritted his teeth, a low, guttural snarl escaping his lips as the immense weight hit his arm. The muscles in his shoulder screamed, tearing under the strain, but his skeletal structure, fortified by the invisible flow of the Earth's energy, held firm. He hung suspended over the abyss, anchoring the boy's life with one hand and the magic of the old gods. Below him, Tim swung wildly, dangling by his harness over the churning sea, hyperventilating. The other Wolfguards above and below froze, staring in absolute awe. To their eyes, Benjen Stark had just defied the laws of nature, catching a falling man with one hand without losing his grip on the slick rock. He looked like a god of iron. Climb, Benjen hissed through gritted teeth, his arm trembling violently. Grab the rock, Tim. Now. Tim, snapping out of his shock, reached out frantically and grabbed a jagged outcropping, pulling his weight off the rope. Benjen let out a ragged breath, releasing the line. His hand was a bloody, blistered mess, but the line held. Secure the next spike, Benjen ordered quietly, looking up at Willem. Move. They climbed the rest of the way in terrified, awed silence. The boys from the winter town had respected their lord's brother before, now, they revered him as something more than human. They reached the lip of the outer wall that surrounded the great keep. The stone here transitioned from natural cliff to worked block, ending in a low parapet designed to prevent men from falling into the sea, rather than to keep armies out. Balin Greyjoy, in his arrogant certainty, had left the sea-facing wall practically unguarded. There were no archer blinds, no boiling oil grates, only a solitary sentry, pacing a 100-yard stretch of the narrow walkway. Willem crested the wall first, pulling himself over the stone lip with absolute silence. He lay flat against the cold flagstones, blending into the shadows. The sentry was walking away from him, a heavy iron battleaxe resting on his shoulder. He was looking out toward the front of the castle, watching the distant glow of Thoros' flaming sword illuminating the night sky, completely distracted by the noise of the siege. Willem rose like smoke. He drew a long, thin dagger from his thigh sheath. He closed the distance in 3 silent strides. He clamped his left hand hard over the sentry's mouth, simultaneously driving the dagger up under the man's ribs, angling sharply into the heart. The sentry stiffened, a muted gurgle escaping his lips against Willem's leather glove. In 3 seconds, he was dead. Willem lowered the heavy body gently to the stones without a sound. Benjen pulled himself over the wall a moment later, followed by the rest of the team. "Strip him," Benjen whispered. 2 wolfguards worked quickly in the dark, pulling the heavy boiled leather tunic, stamped with the golden kraken of House Greyjoy, off the corpse. They took his iron half-helm and his heavy sea cloak. Willem shed his own grey cloak and pulled the ironborn gear over his clothes. It was a tight fit, but in the dark, he looked like any other reaver of pike. Benjen gathered the men in the shadow of a high watchtower. "The outer wall is taken," Benjen said softly, tying a rag tightly around his bleeding right hand. "The diversion is working. The castle is looking outward. We move inward." He looked at Willem. "You are on point. Scout the next walkway. If anyone questions you, you are a runner from the front lines. Do not speak unless spoken to." Willem nodded, adjusting the heavy iron helm. He stepped out of the shadows and began walking briskly down the lit corridor toward the inner bailey, mimicking the heavy, rolling gait of a sailor. The rest of the pack waited in the dark. A minute later, another sentry rounded the corner, carrying a torch. He saw Willem approaching. "You there," the sentry called out over the distant roar of the trebuchets. "What's the word from the main gate? Are the Greenland bastards breaking through?" Willem didn't answer immediately. He kept walking, closing the distance rapidly, head down. "I said, what's the word?" the sentry demanded, stopping and raising his torch to see the man's face. Willem stepped into the light. He didn't slow down. He lunged. Before the sentry could process the unfamiliar face beneath the helm, Willem's short sword flashed. He drove the blade clean through the man's throat, severing the vocal cords and the artery in one brutal, practiced motion. The sentry dropped the torch. Willem caught it before it hit the ground, keeping the light steady as the man collapsed in a pool of his own blood. Willem looked back toward the shadows and gave a sharp, 2-fingered whistle. The wolf guard emerged, jogging silently down the walkway. A second guard quickly stripped the dead sentry, pulling on his kraken tunic and helm. Now, they had 2 ghosts in ironborn skin. Benjen knelt in the shadows of the inner bailey, the massive structure of the great keep looming above them. "We split here," Benjen ordered, using rapid hand signals to emphasize his quiet words. "Willem, take 10 men. Move through the armory corridors. Take out any runners or supply lines you find. I will take the remaining 10 through the lower courtyards." Benjen drew his finger across the map he had studied endlessly in his mind. "We avoid the main barracks. We avoid the Great Hall. Our only objective is the gatehouse. We meet at the base of the stairs leading to the winch room in 20 minutes. If you are engaged, you silence them instantly. If an alarm is raised, the mission fails and we die." "Understood." The 20 boys, lethal, silent killers forged by Ned Stark's ruthless pragmatism, nodded in unison. The pack split. Benjen led his squad through the twisting, damp corridors of Pike. The castle was a miserable place, smelling of stale ale, rust, and salt rot. It was clear the Ironborn put little stock in comfort or sanitation. The distraction at the front was their salvation. They passed open doors where they could hear servants and stragglers arguing about the battle, their attention entirely consumed by the thunderous impacts of the royal trebuchets shaking the walls. They moved like a single organism, flowing from shadow to shadow. They encountered a group of 3 reavers struggling to carry a massive crate of heavy iron quarrels toward the front lines. The Ironborn were swearing loudly, complaining about the weight. Benjen signaled. 3 wolfguards dropped from the low stone rafters above the archway. They fell upon the reavers with synchronized, terrifying precision. Knives found gaps in armor. Hands snapped necks. The 3 Ironborn were dead before the crate they were carrying hit the floor. The wolfguards caught the heavy wooden box, lowering it silently to the stones, and dragged the bodies into an empty storeroom. They kept moving. They were nearing the objective. The noise of the battle was deafening now. They were directly behind the massive curtain wall that separated the castle from the land bridge. Benjen signaled for a halt near a sharp turn in the corridor. He peeked around the stone corner. His blood ran cold. An ironborn captain, wearing heavy scale armor and a cape of woven iron rings, was walking out of a side room, a torch in one hand and a half-eaten leg of mutton in the other. He was walking directly toward them. Benjen pulled his head back. There was nowhere to hide. The corridor was narrow and empty. If they retreated, the captain would hear their boots. If they charged, the heavy armor would slow them down long enough for the man to shout. The heavy footsteps of the captain drew closer. The flickering orange light of his torch began to cast long shadows around the corner. Benjen made a split-second decision. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't signal his men. He reached to his belt and drew a long, perfectly balanced throwing dagger. He breathed in, channeling the unyielding stillness of his force training. Time seemed to stretch and slow to a crawl. He could hear the captain tearing a chunk of meat from the bone. He could hear the exact cadence of the man's footsteps. He calculated the distance, the angle, the weight of the steel in his hand. The captain turned the corner. He stopped, his eyes widening as he saw the 11 figures clad in dark gray, standing in the shadows of his own castle. He dropped the mutton. He opened his mouth to scream a warning that would bring 100 men down upon them. Benjen threw the dagger. He didn't just throw it, he pushed it with a silent surge of his hidden power. The blade flew with terrifying, unnatural speed. It was a straight line of silver cutting through the torchlight. Before the captain could form the first syllable of his shout, the dagger buried itself to the hilt directly into the center of his throat, punching through the soft leather gorget and severing his spine. The captain's eyes rolled back. A spray of blood hit the stone wall behind him. He collapsed backward, a heavy, clattering heap of iron and dead flesh. Benjen exhaled sharply, the focused energy leaving his system. "Drag him," Benjen whispered. 2 guards rushed forward, pulling the heavy corpse into the side room, kicking dirt over the bloodstain. They moved on. They reached the rendezvous point, a wide, circular stairwell that led up into the belly of the massive gatehouse. Willem and his 10 men were already there, waiting in the shadows. The 2 disguised wolf guards stood near the front. Willem held up 2 fingers, indicating they had eliminated 2 patrols without incident. Benjen pointed up the stairs. At the top of the winding steps was a heavy door of solid oak, banded with thick iron. It was the entrance to the winch room, the iron heart that controlled the massive portcullis and the locking beams of the main gates below. Standing guard outside the door were 2 heavily armored ironborn sentries, holding long spears. Benjen looked at Willem and the other disguised guard. He nodded. Willem and his partner walked up the stairs. They didn't sneak. They stomped their boots heavily on the stone, making as much noise as they could to mask the silent approach of the 19 wolves creeping up the steps behind them. The 2 sentries lowered their halberds as the disguised men approached. "Halt," one sentry barked. "No one enters the winch room. Lord Balon's orders." "Orders from the front lines." Willem shouted back, his voice rough and breathless, perfectly mimicking a panicked runner. "The Greenlanders are bringing up a ram. The captain says to ready the secondary chains." The sentries hesitated, glancing at each other. The noise outside was deafening. The story made perfect sense. "We didn't hear no horn," the second sentry grumbled suspiciously. "You can't hear shit over that flaming sword out there," Willem yelled, closing the final few steps. "Open the damn door before they break the gates." The sentries lowered their weapons slightly, moving to unbar the door. It was the only opening the pack needed. Willem lunged, driving a dagger up under the first sentry's chin. His partner mirrored the move, stepping inside the reach of the halberd and burying a short sword in the second man's gut. Both sentries went down without a cry. Benjen bounded up the last few steps. "Open it." Willem lifted the heavy iron latch and pushed the door open. The winch room was massive, filled with the groaning, creaking sounds of the battle raging directly below them. The room was dominated by 2 enormous wooden capstans, wrapped in chains as thick as a man's arm, connected to the heavy counterweights that held the gate mechanisms in place. 5 ironborn engineers were in the room. They were stripped to their waists, sweating profusely as they managed the boiling oil grates and the heavy gears. They turned as the door opened, expecting runners or guards. Instead, a tide of gray cloaks and drawn steel poured into the room. The Wolf Guard did not hesitate. They were absolute instruments of violence. They swarmed the engineers before the men could even reach for the heavy mallets and axes resting against the walls. It was a silent, brutal slaughter. Throats were cut, chests were pierced, and bodies were dropped onto the stone floor amidst the grinding gears. In 10 seconds, the room belonged to the north. Benjen stepped over a bleeding corpse and walked to the edge of the murder hole, looking down. Directly below him, the massive, iron-studded oak doors of Pike's main gate were buckling under the repeated impacts of a battering ram. Outside, the vanguard of the king was screaming for blood. Benjen looked at the massive chains holding the locking beams in place, and the thick, tensioned ropes holding the counterweights that kept the portcullis locked down. He drew red rain. The Valyrian steel seemed to hum in the torchlight, eager to taste the air. "Cut them," Benjen ordered, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. The Wolfguard fell upon the mechanisms. They swung their axes and short swords, hacking violently at the thick hemp ropes holding the massive stone counterweights. Snap! The first rope gave way. A counterweight the size of a large wagon plummeted downward with a terrifying crash, releasing the tension on the locking mechanism of the main doors. Snap! Snap! Benjen swung red rain. The impossibly sharp Valyrian steel sheared straight through a bundle of thick ropes holding the portcullis lock in a single, devastating stroke. The machinery shrieked. Deep within the walls, massive iron gears spun freely. Down below, the heavy wooden locking beams that secured the main gates suddenly lifted away, pulled up by the released weights. The gate was unbarred. Benjen turned to the men. "The doors, push." The Wolfguard threw down their weapons. 21 men put their shoulders against the massive wooden capstans that controlled the gate hinges. They strained, their boots slipping on the bloody floor, pushing with every ounce of strength they possessed. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy gears began to turn. Down in the courtyard below, the ironborn defenders braced against the massive oak doors, mocking the booming impacts of Robert's battering ram. Pike had never fallen. The sea protected their rear, and these thick walls protected their front. But then, deep within the stone, the massive counterweights let out a deafening, unspooling shriek. The heavy wooden locking beams lifted themselves smoothly, as if pulled by unseen, ghostly hands. The ironborn stared in absolute, mind-breaking horror. Suddenly, the ram hit the doors from the outside, and the doors yielded completely. With a loud, groaning screech of rusted hinges, the impregnable gates slowly swung outward toward the enemy, seemingly entirely on their own. They hadn't been breached by the stag, they had been betrayed by the shadows. Robert Baratheon froze for a second, looking at the widening gap. He saw the dark courtyard of Pike beyond. He saw the terrified faces of the ironborn staring at their own open gates. A savage, roaring laugh ripped from the king's throat. "The wolves have bitten," Robert bellowed to the heavens. He lowered his helm, hoisted his hammer, and spurred his horse forward. "Charge! Charge and kill them all!" Thoros of Myr rode beside him, his flaming sword lighting the way. Behind them, a tide of tens of thousands of screaming, blood-mad soldiers poured through the open gates, flooding into the fortress of Pike. High above in the winch room, Benjen Stark leaned heavily against the wooden capstan, listening to the screams of the ironborn below as the royal army annihilated them. He looked at his bleeding hand, at the exhausted faces of his young guards, and wiped a smear of soot from his cheek. The fortress was broken. The diversion had become the execution. "Secure the room," Benjen commanded quietly, resting red rain over his shoulder. "We hold here. Let the king have his fun." 26 comments 0 vote. The Kraken's submission. "The wolves have bitten." Robert's voice thundered, a sound that seemed to shake the very bedrock of the island. He spurred his massive black warhorse forward, lowering his head. The great antlered helm cast a terrifying silhouette against the gloom. "Charge! Charge and kill them all!" Beside the king rode a madman wrapped in faded red robes over heavy chainmail. Thoros of Myr let out a high, wild cackle that sent a shiver down the spines of the ironborn. He raised his longsword, and with a harsh scrape of rough leather against the steel, the blade erupted into brilliant, roaring flames. The wildfire burned with a fierce, emerald and orange light, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the terrified defenders. "The Lord of Light commands you to burn," Thoros screamed, his flaming sword carving a bright, blinding arc through the rain as he plunged into the breach alongside the king. Behind Robert rode the elite brotherhood of the Kingsguard. Esser Barristan Selmy, moving with the fluid, deadly grace that had earned him legend, rode at the king's right flank. Esser Mandan Moore and Esser Boros Blunt flanked the left, their white cloaks rapidly becoming stained with mud and the blood of the defenders. They formed an impenetrable wedge of white enamel and polished steel, an anvil upon which Robert's hammer struck. Robert crashed into the ironborn line like a falling mountain. His warhammer, a weapon too heavy for a normal man to lift, swung in a devastating, horizontal arc. It met the heavy iron shield of an ironborn captain and shattered it to splinters, the crushing force caving in the man's chest and sending him flying backward into his own men. The king did not slow down. He waded into the thickest part of the melee, a god of war demanding his tribute in blood and broken bones. But the king was not alone. The royal host, a vast and diverse coalition of the seven kingdoms, poured through the open gates like a breached dam. To the king's left, Eddard Stark led the northern contingent. The Lord of Winterfell, his face a mask of cold, uncompromising granite. He did not shout or scream, he commanded with a lethal, quiet efficiency. The northern men, clad in their heavy gray wool and chainmail, moved in perfect unison. They formed a relentless, grinding shield wall that pushed into the courtyard, their spears thrusting with rhythmic, brutal precision. They were the glacier to Robert's storm, slowly and inevitably crushing everything in their path. Ned swung his sword, dispatching defenders with the unnerving, unnatural timing of a man who could sense his enemy's intent before their muscles even twitched. To the king's right, a flash of brilliant crimson and gold announced the arrival of the Westerlands. Sir Jaime Lannister, free of his white cloak and fully embracing his role as the heir to Castle Rock, commanded the Golden Lions. He wore a suit of gilded plate armor that caught the light of Thoros' flaming sword, his crimson cloak billowing behind him. Jaime fought with a breathtaking, almost arrogant flair. He parried an axe blow, spun his horse, and drove his gilded blade through an ironborn reaver's neck, all while shouting commands to his vanguard. He fought as if he had something to prove, eager to wash away the lingering stains of his father's late arrival during the rebellion. Pushing through the center, behind the king's wedge, came the disciplined ranks of the Reach, commanded by Lord Randall Tarly. Tarly was a hard, humorless man, and he commanded his soldiers with an iron fist. He marched on foot, wielding the great Valyrian steel sword Heartsbane. He did not engage in the chaotic brawling that the Ironborn favored. He directed his pikemen and heavy infantry to systematically isolate and slaughter pockets of resistance. Under Tarly's command, the soldiers of the Reach were an instrument of execution, devoid of passion but absolute in their effectiveness. And bringing up the rear, ensuring the breach was permanently secured, rode Lord Jon Arryn. The hand of the king led the Knights of the Vale. Their silver armor and sky-blue banners added a regal contrast to the mud and gore of the courtyard. The Ironborn defense, built on the assumption that their thick outer walls would bleed the Greenlanders dry over months of grueling siege, shattered completely. The shock of the inner breach, combined with the overwhelming, coordinated assault of the greatest commanders in Westeros, broke their morale in a matter of minutes. The courtyard of the gatehouse fell with startling speed. The defenders threw down their axes and raised their hands in surrender, or they were trampled into the mud by the sheer weight of the invading host. The great keep of Pike fell within the hour. Jaime Lannister and the vanguard of the Westerlands pushed across the first stone bridges, clearing the lower halls and armories with ruthless speed. But as Robert Baratheon kicked open the heavy doors to the Great Hall, expecting to find his enemy cowering on the seastone chair, he found only empty shadows. "Where is he?" Robert roared, grabbing a bleeding Ironborn captain by the throat and lifting him off the floor. "Where is the Kraken?" "The Sea Tower," the captain choked out, pointing a trembling finger toward the furthest, most isolated stack of rock jutting from the ocean. He barricaded himself in the Sea Tower. Robert threw the man aside and stormed out to the rear courtyard. Ned followed closely behind. The Sea Tower was the oldest part of the castle, perched precariously upon a crooked pillar of stone that looked as though it might collapse into the churning sea at any moment. The only way to reach it was a long, terrifying bridge made of hempen rope and spaced wooden planks that swayed violently in the howling gale. Robert stepped up to the edge of the cliff. He raised his foot to step onto the first plank. Thwack! An iron-tipped arrow ricocheted off Robert's heavy breastplate, sending a spark into the damp air. Robert cursed, stepping back as two more arrows hissed past his face, burying themselves in the dirt. Across the chasm, standing in the narrow archer slits of the Sea Tower, were Balon Greyjoy's finest marksmen. "Bring up the archers," Robert bellowed. "Return fire." "It is useless, Your Grace," Tywin Lannister said smoothly, arriving in the courtyard with a detachment of his red cloaks. The old lion looked completely pristine, despite the carnage of the keep. "The wind is too strong, and their murder holes are too narrow. We cannot shoot them from here. Then we cross," Robert snarled, hefting his hammer. "You cannot," Tywin stated flatly. "You are clad in heavy plate. The bridge is ancient and slick with sea spray. If the arrows do not kill you, the wind will throw you into the ocean. The keep is ours. We simply wait. We cut off their food and starve them out. In a moon's turn, he will throw himself from the window." I am not waiting a moon for a coward who hides in a tower. Robert roared, his face flushing purple with rage. I want him dead today. You won't have to wait, a calm voice cut through the shouting. Robert and Tywin turned. Ned Stark was unbuckling his heavy gray breastplate. He dropped it to the mud with a heavy clatter. He unfastened his chainmail hauberk and pulled it over his head, leaving himself in nothing but dark, boiled leather and a simple tunic. He drew his sword and discarded his scabbard. Ned, what in the seven hells are you doing? Robert asked, his anger turning to confusion. Armor is certain death on that bridge, Ned said, his voice entirely devoid of fear. He looked across the terrifying, swaying span of rope and wood. I will bring him to you. Lord Stark, that is madness, Tywin said, his green eyes narrowing. They will feather you before you reach the halfway point. Let them try, Ned said softly. Ned stepped out from the cover of the stone archway. He didn't walk tentatively onto the bridge, he moved with absolute, fluid purpose. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, finding the deep, silent currents of the earth and the wind. He stepped onto the first wooden plank. The bridge bucked violently under the gale, a terrifying drop of black water raging hundreds of feet below. A normal man would have clung to the hempen handrails for dear life, inching forward. Ned did not touch the handrails. He moved across the swaying, uneven planks with the eerie, weightless grace of a shadowcat. He shifted his balance flawlessly with every violent lurch of the wind, anticipating the movement of the bridge before it even happened. From the sea tower, the archers saw the unarmored man and loosed their shafts. Ned heard the sharp twang of the bowstrings over the roar of the ocean. He didn't break his stride. He felt the deadly flight path of the arrows homing in on his chest. Without slowing down, Ned raised his sword in a blur of motion. Clang, thwack, he deflected the first arrow with the flat of his blade, sending it spinning into the abyss. He pivoted his torso by a mere inch, allowing the second arrow to whistle harmlessly past his shoulder, slicing the fabric of his tunic but drawing no blood. He kept running. The Ironborn archers scrambled to reload, panic setting in as they watched the Lord of Winterfell sprint across the treacherous bridge as if it were a paved road. They fired a second, panicked volley. Ned dropped to one knee, sliding across a wet plank, the arrows passing over his head, and exploded back to his feet, covering the last 20 yards in a breathtaking sprint. He reached the far stone landing of the sea tower, breathing evenly, his blade humming in his hand. Blocking the heavy oak door to the tower's interior stood a nightmare of a man. Dagmar Cleftjaw. His face was a horrific ruin, split nearly in two by an axe blow long ago, giving him a gruesome, permanent grin. He wielded a massive, rusted battle-axe, and he looked at Ned with pure, unadulterated bloodlust. You don't cross here, wolf, Dagmar snarled, stepping forward to block the entrance. The bridge was the hard part, Ned said coldly. Dagmar roared and swung his heavy axe in a brutal, decapitating arc. Ned didn't bother trying to parry the massive weight. He used the narrow, confined space of the stone landing to his advantage. He ducked under the heavy swing, allowing the weight of the blow to carry Dagmar slightly off balance. With blinding speed, Ned drove the heavy iron pommel of his longsword directly into the center of Dagmar's ruined face. The sound of shattering bone echoed over the crashing waves. Dagmar Cleftjaw's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the stone landing like a felled tree, out cold. Ned stepped over the fearsome captain. He raised a booted foot and kicked the heavy iron latch of the tower door. It splintered inward with a loud crash. Ned stepped into the gloomy solar of the sea tower. Balon Greyjoy stood by the window, his driftwood crown upon his head, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. But he was shaking. He had watched the impossible sprint across the bridge. He had watched his greatest captain fall in a single breath. Ned raised his sword, pointing the tip directly at Balon's throat. The war is over, Balon, Ned stated, his voice a freezing wind. Walk, or I will throw you from that window. The doors to the great hall of Pike were kicked open by two massive Stormlands knights. The hall was a gloomy, cavernous space, smelling of stale seawater, damp stone, and old smoke. It was devoid of the finery and tapestries found in the castles of the mainland. The only decoration of note was the seastone chair, a massive, ancient throne carved from a single block of oily black stone in the shape of a giant kraken. King Robert Baratheon was already sitting on it. He slouched against the oily stone, his warhammer resting across his armored knees, looking entirely unimpressed by the legendary seat of the Ironborn. Tywin Lannister, Jon Arryn, Jaime Lannister, and Randall Tarly fanned out behind him, representing the united, crushing power of the Iron Throne. Footsteps echoed from the entrance. Ned Stark walked into the hall, still wearing his boiled leather, his sword sheathed. Walking ahead of him, his hands bound tightly with heavy rope, was Balin Greyjoy. Balin looked gaunt, severe, and utterly lost to his own false reality. He still wore his heavy cloak of krakenskin and his crude driftwood crown. He kept his back straight, his face carved into a mask of bitter, unyielding pride, trying to ignore the fact that he was a prisoner in his own hall. Two heavily armored guards of the royal vanguard stepped forward, grabbing the Lord of the Iron Islands by the shoulders and forcing him roughly to his knees on the cold, damp stone floor before the king. Robert looked down at the kneeling man. He shifted his grip on his warhammer. For a second, Ned thought Robert might simply cave the man's skull in right there on the floor. Instead, Robert let out a short, dismissive snort. "You have bled my realm, Balin," Robert stated, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "You burned my good father's fleet. You raided my shores. You crowned yourself with a piece of driftwood and called yourself a king." Balin tilted his chin up, glaring at the massive Baratheon. Even in defeat, he clung to his defiance. "You may take my head, usurper," Balin spat, his voice harsh and grating. "I will gladly feast in the drowned god's watery halls. I rose in rebellion because I am ironborn. I never swore oaths to a Baratheon. You are no dragon." A heavy silence descended upon the hall. The surrounding lords bristled at the insolence. Jaime Lannister's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, ready to silence the traitor if the king gave the nod. "You never swore oaths to a Baratheon," Robert repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He leaned forward, the steel of his armor groaning. "Then now you will swear oaths." Robert straightened up, resting the head of his hammer on the stone floor with a heavy thud. "I am not going to give you the satisfaction of a martyr's death, Greyjoy," Robert declared, his voice booming with absolute authority. "I am not going to let the Ironborn sing songs about how bravely you died. You are going to live. You are going to live, and you are going to watch me strip your miserable islands of everything that allows you to be a nuisance." Robert turned away from the kneeling man, looking toward his hand. "Jon, read him the terms of his survival." Jon Arryn stepped forward, unrolling a heavy parchment scroll he had carried in a waterproof tube at his belt. He cleared his throat, his demeanor shifting into that of the seasoned statesman. "Balin of House Greyjoy," Jon Arryn began, his voice carrying the weight of royal decree. "By the grace of King Robert, your life is spared, but your rebellion demands restitution to ensure the peace of the realm is never broken by the Iron Islands again." Jon Arryn looked down at the parchment. "Firstly, the war fleet of the Iron Islands shall be permanently curtailed. You are hereby forbidden from constructing or maintaining any war galley or carrack. Furthermore, the total number of longships permitted across all the islands combined shall be limited to 50 vessels, strictly for the purpose of fishing and coastal trade. Any ship built beyond this limit will be burned by the royal fleet, and the shipwrights executed." Balon's eyes widened in horror. 50. You would strip us of our sails. You leave us defenseless. You leave yourselves defenseless when you attack your neighbors, Randall Tarley interjected coldly from the sidelines. You will learn to farm the rocks, Greyjoy, or you will starve. Jon Arryn continued, ignoring the interruption. Secondly, a heavy tribute shall be levied upon the Iron Islands for a period of 20 years. This tribute shall be paid in iron ore, salt, and whatever meager coin your merchants can gather, to rebuild the fleets and towns you have burned in the Westerlands and the Riverlands. Balin ground his teeth, his hands balling into fists. To be taxed by Greenlanders was the ultimate humiliation to the old way. Ned Stark stepped forward, taking his place beside Jon Arryn. His presence was a cold, imposing anchor in the room. Thirdly, Ned said, his voice cutting through the damp air like a blade of ice. We dismantle the foundation of your cruelty. He looked directly into Balon's furious eyes. By royal decree, the practice of thraldom is abolished upon the Iron Islands, Ned stated firmly. Every thrall currently held in bondage upon Pike, Great Wick, Orkmont, and every other rock you claim, is to be immediately released. They are free men and women. They are property, Balin snarled, struggling against the guards holding him down. They are the spoils of the iron price. You cannot simply erase our culture with a stroke of a pen. We can, and we have, Ned countered, utterly unmoved by the outburst. Furthermore, the practice of taking salt wives is forbidden. Any woman held against her will is to be released and offered passage back to the mainland. Any Ironborn caught raiding for captives in the future will be hanged as a slaver, not a soldier. Balin looked physically ill. Ned had anticipated this. In the War Council weeks ago, Ned had argued that breaking the Iron Fleet was not enough, they had to break the foundation of stolen labor that fueled the reaving. Without thralls to mine the iron and work the sparse fields, the ironborn men would be forced to labor themselves, leaving them no time to build ships or launch rebellions. It was a breaking of their old ways. You destroy us, Balin whispered, his defiance cracking under the weight of the terms. You make us weak. We make you civilized, Jon Arryn corrected. Or, at the very least, contained. Jon Arryn rolled the parchment back up, tucking it away. He looked at King Robert, who nodded, signaling that the final, most crucial term was to be addressed. Words and parchment are easily burned, Balin Greyjoy, Jon Arryn said, his tone turning grave. We require a guarantee of your future good behavior. A hostage to ensure that these terms are met and that the peace is kept. Jon Arryn gestured to a pair of guards standing near the heavy oak doors of the hall. The guards stepped aside, pushing a small figure forward. It was a boy, no older than 10 years. He was dressed in a fine tunic bearing the golden kraken, though the fabric was currently rumpled and stained with the dirt of a fallen castle. Theon Greyjoy, the last surviving son of Balin. His 2 older brothers had died in the rebellion, Roderick crushed by the Northern Fleet at Sea Dragon Point, and Meryn killed during the breach of the southern wall of Pike. Theon looked terrified. He tried to puff out his narrow chest, trying desperately to emulate the haughty, fearless sneer of his father, but his lower lip trembled, and his eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the towering, blood-stained lords of the mainland. He was a boy surrounded by monsters. Balin looked at his sole remaining heir. His expression did not soften. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a grim, cold acceptance of the cost of defeat. The boy, Theon, shall be taken from Pike, Jon Arryn announced. He will be raised as a ward of the crown. As long as you remain loyal and adhere to the terms of your surrender, the boy will be treated with the honor due his station, and will eventually return to rule Pike upon your passing. If you rebel again. Jon let the unspoken threat hang heavily in the air. The boy's life was forfeit. Theon swallowed hard, looking toward his father for a word of comfort, a reassurance. Balin offered none. He simply stared straight ahead. Jon Arryn turned to the assembled lords. This was a matter that had been discussed quietly on the voyage over. Lord Stark, Jon Arryn said, addressing his former foster son. You are the warden of the North. Pike lies nearest your shores. It would be fitting for the boy to be fostered at Winterfell. He would learn the harsh truths of the North, and the value of honor. Ned Stark looked down at the boy. Theon Greyjoy stared back, trying to look defiant, but managing only to look small and miserable. Ned felt a deep, instinctive revulsion. He thought of his own children. He thought of Cregan's boisterous laughter, of Jon's quiet, observant eyes, of Rhaenys' fierce pride, of Sansa and Arya, and of the new baby Ashara carried. Winterfell was a sanctuary. It was a pack. To bring an Ironborn into that pack, to bring the son of a man who thrived on treachery, cruelty, and the belief that taking what belonged to others was a divine right. I would rather have a rabid dog under my roof than an Ironborn, Ned thought, his private thoughts cold and uncompromising. A dog can be trained. These people are weasels, raised on salt and entitlement. If I bring him into my home, he will poison the well. He will look at my sons with envy, and he will look at my daughters with the eyes of a reaver. Ned kept his face entirely neutral, but his voice was hard rock. I must decline the honor, Lord Arryn, Ned stated clearly, his words echoing in the silent hall. Theon blinked, a flash of surprise crossing his face. Jon Arryn frowned, clearly having expected Ned to accept the burden of duty as he always did. Decline, Jon Arryn asked, stepping closer. Ned, the boy needs a firm hand. The North is full, Ned interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. I already have a castle full of children in Winterfell, Jon. I have my own sons, my daughters, and my wards to raise and instruct. I do not have the time, nor the inclination, to raise another man's son. Especially not one of his. Ned cast a fleeting, dismissive glance at Balin Greyjoy. Let him go somewhere else. I don't want him. The blunt rejection stung. Theon flushed a deep red, humiliation warring with his fear. Even as a hostage, he expected to be treated as a prize of value, not a piece of unwanted refuse. Jon Arryn sighed, rubbing his temples. He needed to place the boy securely. He looked around the circle of high lords. Mace Tyrell looked entirely uninterested, likely fearing the boy would tarnish the pristine courts of Highgarden. Randall Tarley looked too cruel. The boy would likely not survive a year at Horn Hill. John's eyes landed on the towering figure in crimson and gold. "Lord Tywin," Jon Arryn said, pivoting the strategy smoothly. "The Westerlands bore the brunt of Greyjoy's initial treachery. Lannisport burned. It would be fitting justice, and a secure arrangement, for the boy to be fostered at Castle Rock." Tywin Lannister stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He had remained silent throughout the proceedings, weighing the shifting balance of power in the room. He looked at the boy, Theon. Tywin did not see a frightened child. He saw an empty vessel waiting to be filled with the proper lessons. Ned Stark is a fool, Tywin thought, a cold calculation turning in his mind. He throws away a priceless asset out of misplaced northern pride. If Theon Greyjoy was raised at Castle Rock, he would not be raised with honor or warmth. He would be raised with Lannister gold, Lannister discipline, and Lannister ambition. Tywin would break the boy's crude ironborn spirit and fill the void with an overwhelming awe and fear of the lion. He would surround the boy with Westerland's knights, teach him the value of wealth over the iron price, and mold him into a perfect, compliant pawn. When Balon Greyjoy eventually died, Tywin would send Theon back to the Iron Islands not as a kraken, but as a lion in a kraken's skin. The future Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands would be entirely in Tywin's grip, securing the western seas for House Lannister for a generation. "I will take the boy," Tywin stated, his voice smooth and authoritative. He stepped forward, his cold green eyes locking onto Theon. The boy shrank back slightly from the imposing Lord of the Rock. "Castle Rock is vast, Lord Arryn," Tywin continued, his gaze never leaving the boy. "He will be properly instructed. He will learn what it means to cross House Lannister, and he will learn the benefits of our protection. I accept the wardship." "Then it is settled," Robert Baratheon declared, slamming his warhammer against the stone floor with a final, ringing crack. Robert looked down at Balon one last time. "Get out of my sight, Balon. Swear your oaths to Jon Arryn, sign the treaties, and then crawl back into whatever damp hole you sleep in. If I ever have to sail my fleet to these miserable rocks again, I won't be taking hostages. I will sink the entire island." Robert turned his back on the defeated Lord of the Iron Islands and marched out of the Great Hall, his Kingsguard trailing behind him. Ned Stark watched Tywin Lannister motion for his guards to take custody of Theon. He saw the cold satisfaction in the old lion's eyes. Ned knew exactly what Tywin intended to do with the boy. And Ned didn't care. Let Tywin play his games of influence and control with the squids. Let the West deal with the treacherous blood of Pike. Ned turned and walked out of the hall, breathing in the cold, salty air of the courtyard. He looked to the north, his mind already crossing the leagues of ocean and land. The rebellion was crushed. The seas were safe. 35 comments 0 vote. The Wolf's Invitation. The Great Hall of Pike was a dreary, cavernous space, smelling eternally of damp stone, old smoke, and the bitter salt of the sea. Yet, on this particular morning, it was filled with the vibrant, triumphant colors of the mainland. The banners of the stag, the falcon, the lion, the rose, the trout, and the direwolf hung from the high rafters, completely overwhelming the golden kraken of the defeated host. The proceedings were finished. Balon Greyjoy had knelt, his pride shattered, his fleet at the bottom of the sea, and his surviving heirs shipped away to the Westerlands. The reparations had been signed, the thraldom abolished, and the Iron Islands permanently shackled by the decrees of the Iron Throne. Eddard Stark stood near the massive, oily black stone of the seastone chair, which King Robert currently used as a footrest. The Warden of the North looked out over the assembled lords of the realm. They had bled together, marched together, and broken a rebellion together. Now, the frenzy of battle was fading, replaced by the weary anticipation of the long journey home. Ned stepped forward, raising a hand. The low murmur of conversations in the hall quieted, the lords turning their attention to the man who had breached the unbreachable walls of Pike. "My lords," Ned's voice resonated clearly through the damp hall. "The war is won, the king's justice has been delivered, and the peace of the realm is secured." A polite, tired cheer went up from the gathered nobility. "Many of you will turn your sails south and east today, eager to return to your hearths and your families," Ned continued. But before the host scatters to the winds, House Stark would extend an invitation. Ned looked toward the heavy oak doors, where his brother Benjen stood beside the towering, fierce figure of Dacy Mormont. "The Ironborn Rebellion interrupted a matter of great joy in the north," Ned announced, a rare, genuine smile touching his features. "My brother, Lord Benjen Stark of Sea, was entirely ready to speak his vows before the Heart Tree when Balon Greyjoy decided to test our patience. We delayed the celebration to answer the king's call. Ned swept his gaze across the room, catching the eyes of the High Lords. I invite every lord who campaigned in this war to join us. The wedding of Lord Benjen Stark and Lady Daisy Mormont shall take place in a fortnight. We will host the celebration not in the cold of Winterfell, but at my brother's new seat, Sea Dragon Point. It is but a short voyage up the coast from these miserable rocks. Come, drink our ale, eat our meat, and celebrate the peace we have forged. For a moment, the hall was silent as the lords weighed the prospect of a northern wedding against the comfort of their own beds. King Robert Baratheon did not hesitate. Robert kicked his boots off the seastone chair and vaulted to his feet. A massive, booming grin split his black beard. A wedding, Robert roared, his voice shaking the dust from the rafters. By the gods, Ned, that is the best news I have heard since we smashed their fleet. Finally, a reason to drink for joy instead of drinking to forget the smell of this wretched island. Jon Arryn sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. Your Grace, the capital requires your presence. The realm can wait, Robert interrupted, waving a massive hand dismissively at his hand. The realm is perfectly safe. The dragons are gone, the squids are broken. What am I to do in King's Landing? Sit on that chair of daggers and listen to minor lords complain about grain taxes? No, I am going to the north. I want to see this new castle of Benjen's, and I want to drink that clear firewater until I cannot feel my own face. Robert clapped a hand on Ned's shoulder, leaning in close. You have saved me, Ned. You have given me an excuse to avoid my council for another moon. I am the first to accept your invitation. Ned chuckled quietly. You are always welcome, Your Grace. We will ensure the cellars are fully stocked. The king's enthusiastic endorsement broke the dam. If the king was attending, it was no longer merely a wedding, it was a royal procession. The political weight of the event shifted instantly, and the High Lords quickly began recalculating their travel plans. That night, the royal encampment outside the walls of Pike was quieter than it had been in weeks. The siege engines were being dismantled, the tents packed away, and the spoils of war loaded onto the transport galleys. Ned sat alone in his stark, unadorned command pavilion. The wind howled off the sunset sea, snapping the heavy canvas, but the brazier in the corner kept the biting chill at bay. He was reviewing the supply manifests for the Western Fleet when the flap of his tent parted. Maester Vyman, an older, diligent man who had accompanied the northern host from Winterfell, stepped inside. He bowed low, his chain of office clinking softly. A raven, Lord Stark, the Maester said, extending a small, tightly rolled scroll sealed with white wax. From Winterfell. Maester Luwin sent it with the utmost urgency. Ned took the scroll, his heart giving a sudden, sharp thud against his ribs. A raven from home during a war could mean disaster. A wildling breach, an illness. He broke the seal with his thumb and unrolled the parchment near the light of the oil lamp. He recognized Luwin's neat, precise handwriting immediately. To Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North. The gods have smiled upon Winterfell. Lady Ashara has been delivered of a healthy, strong child. The labor was swift and without complication. It is a boy, my lord. He has the dark hair of his father, and the lungs of a true wolf. Lady Ashara rests comfortably and sends her deepest love, demanding your swift return. The castle rejoices. We await your word on the boy's naming. Maester Luwin. Ned read the letter twice. Then a third time. The tension that had resided in his shoulders for months finally melted away, replaced by an overwhelming wave of relief and joy. Another son, another wolf for the pack. While he had been bringing fire and sword to the Iron Islands, Ashara had brought new life into the world. He lowered the parchment, a wide, unguarded smile breaking across his face. Good news, my lord. Maester Vyman asked tentatively, seeing the change in his liege lord's demeanor. The best news, Vyman, Ned breathed, looking up. My wife has given birth. A boy, healthy and strong. Vyman's face broke into a delighted smile. Congratulations, Lord Stark. That is a true blessing. The old gods and the new watch over your house. They do, Ned agreed. He moved to his small writing desk, pulling forward a fresh sheet of thick parchment and an inkwell. I must write to her immediately. And to Roderick, and to Dorne. Ned dipped his quill, his mind racing. First, he wrote to Ashara. The letter was not the formal correspondence of a lord, but the desperate, affectionate words of a husband who had been away too long. He wrote of his profound relief, of his longing to see her and hold their new child. He praised her strength, and at the bottom of the parchment, he wrote the name he had chosen for the boy. Rickard. It was a name that carried the weight of the North. It honored the father he had lost to the Mad King's fire, the lord who had shaped the north before him. Rickard Stark. It felt right. Next, he penned a swift, authoritative missive to Sir Roderick Castle in Winterfell. Roderick, the war is won. We sail for Sea Dragon Point to celebrate my brother's wedding. Send word to the keeps of the west to ensure the larders are full and the roads are clear. Bring an honor guard from Winterfell to the coast. The king rides with us, and we must show him the true hospitality of the north. Finally, Ned took a third piece of parchment. This one required more delicate phrasing. He addressed it to Prince Doran Martell and Prince Oberyn Martell at Sunspear. He wrote of the victory at Pike, knowing the Dornish would appreciate the humbling of the arrogant Ironborn. But the true purpose of the letter was the invitation. He formally invited the princes of Dorne to travel to Sea Dragon Point for the wedding. He sealed the 3 letters with the direwolf stamp and handed them to Maester Vyman. Send these at first light, Ned commanded. At once, Lord Stark, Vyman bowed, taking the letters and departing into the windy night. Ned poured himself a small measure of winter's breath from his private flask. He raised the silver cup to the shadows of the tent. To Rickard, Ned whispered softly, drinking the fiery spirit. The next morning, the encampment was a hive of chaotic, joyful activity. The men knew they were going home, or at least, going to a feast. Ned found Robert near the docks, loudly directing a group of unfortunate squires who were struggling to load a massive, captured Ironborn Kraken statue onto the king's flagship. Careful with that, you clumsy fools. Robert bellowed. I intend to mount that monstrosity over the gates of the Red Keep. I want everyone who enters my city to know what happens to those who cross the stag. It is an ugly piece of metal, Bobby, Ned noted, walking up beside the king. It is a trophy, Ned. Robert laughed, turning to face his friend. It will look magnificent. Ned smiled. I bring better news than captured iron. A raven arrived from Winterfell in the night. Ashara has given birth. Robert's eyes widened, and he let out a cheer that startled the seagulls circling the harbor. Another pup, Robert roared, throwing a heavy arm around Ned's shoulders and pulling him into a bone-rattling embrace. By the gods, Ned, you are relentless. A boy or a girl? A boy, Ned said, extracting himself from the king's grip. We are naming him Rickard. Robert's boisterous demeanor softened for a fraction of a second at the mention of the name. He remembered the stern, unyielding Lord Rickard who had been burned alive for demanding justice. Rickard, Robert repeated softly. He nodded his head in profound respect. It is a good name, Ned. A strong name. He would be proud of you. Look at what you have built. Robert shook off the melancholy instantly, his customary exuberance returning. Well, we have even more reason to celebrate now. A wedding, a victory, and a new son. Tell your captains to raise the sails, Ned. I cannot wait to see this Sea Dragon Point. I hope your brewers have been working overtime. They have, Your Grace, Ned assured him. As the morning progressed, the great host began to fracture. The burden of moving tens of thousands of men meant that not everyone could attend a wedding on the northern coast. The vast majority of the southern infantry, the heavy horse of the Reach, and the common foot soldiers of the Riverlands were ordered to board the transport galleys and sail south, back to their respective liege lords and harvests. However, a select group of high lords chose to remain behind, accepting Ned's invitation for a myriad of different, highly personal reasons. Ned stood near the command tents, watching the departures, when the towering, golden figure of Lord Tywin Lannister approached him. Tywin did not look like a man who had just won a war. He looked like a man who had been deeply, personally insulted. The burning of the Lannister fleet at Lannisport was a humiliation that Tywin would not soon forget, nor forgive. He had spent the entire campaign on Pike directing the siege with a cold, ruthless efficiency, but the victory brought him no joy. Lord Stark, Tywin said, his voice a flat, emotionless drawl. Lord Tywin, Ned replied evenly. I must decline your invitation to the north, Tywin stated, his green eyes calculating. The Westerlands require my immediate attention. The Ironborn filth burned my shipyards. I must return to Castle Rock to oversee the construction of a new fleet. I will not have the western coast left vulnerable to further insolence. A wise precaution, Ned agreed politely. He knew Tywin's pride was wounded by the sheer dominance of the northern Carracks. Tywin intended to build ships that could rival them, a task that would consume his gold and his time for years to come. However, Tywin continued, his gaze drifting to the side. House Lannister will be represented at the wedding. I am leaving my son, Jaime, to accompany the king's procession. Ned glanced over Tywin's shoulder. Standing a few paces away, Sir Jaime Lannister was pointedly ignoring his father, pretending to inspect the sharpness of his sword. Tywin lowered his voice slightly. He requires exposure to the realm as my heir. He spent too long hiding behind a white cloak. See that he conducts himself with the dignity required of his station. Sir Jaime is a grown man, Lord Tywin, Ned said mildly. He requires no supervision from me. Tywin offered a stiff, formal nod. We shall see. Safe voyage, Lord Stark. The old lion turned and stalked toward his flagship, his crimson cloak dragging in the dust. Once his father was out of earshot, Jaime Lannister moved over to Ned. The young knight let out a long, theatrical exhale, the tension bleeding from his shoulders. Praise the Seven, Jaime muttered, flashing his trademark, arrogant grin. I thought he would never leave. If I had to endure another week on a ship with him lecturing me about the price of timber and the legacy of the rock, I would have thrown myself into the sea. You are eager for the north, then? Ned asked, amused by the young lion's transparent relief. I am eager for anywhere my father is not, Jaime corrected, mounting his horse with fluid grace. Besides, I have developed a taste for your northern spirits. And I wish Tyrion were here. My little brother would absolutely revel in the misery of these Ironborn, and he would drink your wedding feast dry. Alas, he is stuck in Castle Rock, reading books and annoying my aunt. Perhaps he can attend the next one, Ned offered. Perhaps, Jaime laughed. Nearby, Lord Mace Tyrell was engaged in a loud, blustering conversation with Paxter Redwyn. The Lord of Highgarden had also elected to stay and travel to see Dragon Point. Mace claimed loudly to anyone who would listen that he was staying to honor the brave Northmen and strengthen the bonds of the realm. In truth, Mace was terrified of returning to Highgarden to Lady Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns. Mace was using the wedding as a convenient, royal excuse to delay facing his mother's sharp tongue for at least another moon. Standing apart from the boisterous Tyrells was Lord Randall Tarley. The austere, martial Lord of Hornhill had no love for feasts, and even less love for the cold. Yet, he too had accepted the invitation. Ned watched as Tarley stood near the edge of the northern encampment, his dark eyes fixed intently on a squad of Wolfguard. The young, grey-cloaked warriors were breaking down their tents, moving with a silent, terrifying efficiency. They did not shout orders, they moved as a unified host, anticipating each other's actions. He was also coming to the wedding of Benjen and Daisy. As the morning wore on, the alliances of the new reign solidified. Lord Hoster Tully and his brother, Brynden the Blackfish, confirmed they would attend, eager to show the realm that the Riverlands remained firmly tied to the Baratheon-Stark coalition. Jon Royce, the imposing Lord of Runestone, stepped forward to represent the Vale, bringing his booming voice and bronze armor to the northern party. Noticeably absent from the revelers was Stannis Baratheon. The master of ships had marched up to Ned earlier in the day, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it might shatter. I am returning to Dragonstone, Lord Stark, Stannis had announced rigidly. The royal fleet requires refitting. And I have a wife who expects my return. I have no time for dancing, drinking, or frivolity. The word frivolity sounded like a curse in his mouth. Duty calls us all, Lord Stannis, Ned had replied respectfully. We will drink a toast to your health. Do not waste the wine, Stannis had grunted before turning on his heel and marching away, leaving a wake of stern disapproval behind him. Jon Arryn, too, was departing, though with far more grace than Stannis. The elderly hand of the king looked exhausted. The war had taken a toll on him, and the prospect of managing the realm's coin while the king went on a northern holiday weighed heavily on his shoulders. Keep an eye on him, Ned, Jon Arryn had requested privately, looking toward where Robert was loudly arguing with a ship captain. Someone must sit the Iron Throne and manage the realm. If the king is not present, the hand must be. Try to ensure he does not completely empty your treasury, or break his neck on a hunt. I will manage him, Jon, Ned promised. Get some rest in the capital. The hard part is over. By midday, the sorting of the armies was complete. The transport galleys of the south rode out of the harbor, turning their prows toward the warmer waters of the Reach in the Westerlands. Remaining in the harbor were the 50 massive northern carracks, and the king's heavily damaged, but still functional, flagship, the Stag's Wrath. Ned stood on the high quarterdeck of the Winter's Wrath. The captured Ironborn longship, the Silence, was secured by heavy towing chains to the rear of the northern flagship, a dark, silent trophy of their absolute victory. He was giving his captain the order to cast off when heavy, uneven footsteps sounded on the gangplank. Hold the lines, a booming voice commanded. Ned turned to see King Robert Baratheon stomping aboard the northern flagship, flanked by 2 bewildered Kingsguard knights. Robert carried a skin of wine in one hand and a half-eaten leg of mutton in the other. "Robert," Ned asked, surprised, "your ship is the Stag's Wrath." "I am not sailing on that battered piece of driftwood," Robert announced loudly, tossing the mutton bone over the side and wiping his mouth on his sleeve. "The Stag's Wrath smells of bilge water, rotting fish, and John Aaron's lingering complaints. The sails are torn and the captain has a face like a sour plum." Robert looked around the immaculate, towering deck of the Winter's Wrath with deep appreciation. "I'm sailing with you, Ned," Robert declared, clapping Ned on the shoulder. "Your ships ride smoother, your cabins are larger, and most importantly, you have the good liquor. Why suffer in a leaky bucket when I can sail on a floating fortress with my brother?" Ned let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "As you command, your grace. The flagship is yours." "Good," Robert grinned, turning to his Kingsguard. "Go tell the rest of my party to follow us or drown, I don't care which. Ned and I have catching up to do." The wind caught the massive lateen sails. The carracks pulled away from the desolate, jagged rocks of Pike, leaving the broken iron islands behind. "Set the course," Ned commanded his captain, as Robert loudly uncorked a fresh bottle of northern spirits beside him. "Take us to the Sea Dragon." 3-3 comments 0 vote. To Sea Dragon Point, the Winter's Wrath carved through the dark, rolling swells of the sunset sea with the effortless grace of a predator returning to its den. The massive triangular sails, dyed a deep, stormy gray, billowed outward, capturing the fierce winds that blew from the south and translating them into raw, terrifying speed. It was the second night since the combined vanguard had departed the subdued, broken shores of Pike, leaving Lord Tywin Lannister and the rest of the slow, cumbersome southern galleys far behind to manage the occupation. They were sailing north, straight for Sea Dragon Point. The air was biting and damp, smelling of salt, wet timber, and the lingering sweetness of absolute victory. On the high quarterdeck of the northern flagship, the atmosphere was far from the tense, somber mood that usually followed a war. It felt more like the eve of a grand tourney. Benjen Stark and Daisy Mormont were engaged in a spirited, highly competitive bout of knife-throwing near the starboard rail. They had set up a thick wooden barrel as a target, carving a crude, tentacled shape into the wood to represent the defeated Balon Greyjoy. "You are releasing too late, Daisy," Benjen critiqued, leaning against the rail with his arms crossed, watching as Daisy's throwing dagger thudded into the outer edge of the barrel, missing the carved kraken entirely. She wore her floating boiled leather armor, her dark hair braided tightly against the sea wind. "You throw a dagger like you swing that heavy mace of yours. It requires a flick of the wrist, not a heave of the shoulder." Daisy scowled, retrieving her blade. At 19, she was tall and fierce, possessing the proud, slightly defensive nature of Bear Island. "I hit the barrel, didn't I? A man's chest is wider than a barrel. An Ironborn's head is smaller than a turnip, and twice as dense," Benjen shot back, pulling a long, wicked-looking dirk from his belt. "Watch and learn, my lady." With a movement so fluid it seemed almost lazy, Benjen snapped his wrist. The dirk spun through the salty air and buried itself dead center in the carved kraken's eye with a solid, satisfying thwack. Daisy stared at the quivering hilt, then let out a long breath, a reluctant smile breaking her scowl. "Show off." Merely demonstrating proper technique, Benjen grinned, stepping forward to nudge her shoulder playfully, a gesture Daisy returned with a firm shove. "You will thank me when we reach the point and you aren't throwing your knives into the courtyard walls." Seated at a heavy oak table securely bolted to the deck nearby, Ned Stark watched the young couple with a quiet, genuine smile. The tension of the war, the burden of commanding fleets and armies, seemed to wash away in the face of their easy, teasing affection. They were well matched, the fierce, unyielding she-bear and the steady, grounded wolf. "They remind me of us, back in the Eyrie," a booming voice echoed from the stairwell leading up from the main deck. "Except neither of us were that pretty, and Jon Arryn would have tanned our hides for throwing blades at the wine barrels." King Robert Baratheon stomped up onto the quarterdeck. He looked magnificent, untamed, and entirely bored. He had shed his heavy, dented plate armor, trading it for a massive tunic of thick black wool embroidered with the golden stag. In his right hand, he casually carried a small, heavy wooden cask under his arm, holding it as easily as a normal man might carry a loaf of bread. "Your Grace," Daisy said, offering a crisp, martial bow, while Benjen respectfully lowered his head. "None of that, Your Grace, nonsense tonight," Robert waved his massive, free hand dismissively. We are at sea. The crown is sitting in a box in my cabin, where it belongs. Tonight, I am just a man dying of thirst on a wooden island. Robert strode over to the heavy oak table and slammed the cask down. It landed with a heavy, sloshing thud. I am going mad in that cabin, Ned, Robert declared, pulling out a heavy chair and throwing his bulk into it. The wood groaned in loud protest. Your northern ships ride so smoothly it hardly feels like sailing at all. Tywin Lannister is probably vomiting his pride over the side of his galley right now, and here we sit, gliding over the waves like a swan. It's entirely too peaceful. I need noise. I need a distraction. Ned chuckled, reaching out to inspect the cask. He recognized the burned brand on the wood. It was a dark, heavy stout from the Riverlands, likely liberated from the supply trains before they set sail. We will have noise enough when the wedding feast begins at Sea Dragon Point, Robert, Ned said calmly. Enjoy the quiet while you can. Your ribs are still healing from the breach at Pike. A scratch, Robert scoffed, thumping his broad chest, wincing only slightly as the bruised muscles pulled. The brute at the gate was slow, strong as an ox, but he swung that axe like he was underwater. I smashed his breastplate so hard his ancestors felt it in the drowned god's halls. Robert leaned forward, his blue eyes bright with the lingering thrill of their triumph. But you were something else, Ned. I saw you cut through that courtyard. You moved like a shadow. And the way you forced Balin to his knees. I have never seen you rule with such absolute iron. It was not iron, Robert, Ned corrected quietly, his gray eyes steady. It was necessity. Balin Greyjoy was a rot on the realm. I simply contained it. Well, you contained it beautifully. Robert roared, reaching for two large pewter tankards that sat in the center of the table. He pulled the wooden bung from the top of the cask with his teeth, spat it over the side of the ship, and began pouring the dark, frothy ale. We broke their fleet. We shattered their spine. We kicked in their front door and dragged Balin out by his miserable gray beard. Robert slid a brimming tankard across the table to Ned. Drink with me, Robert commanded, raising his own mug. To the wolves and the stags. To the wolves and the stags, Ned agreed, raising his cup and taking a long draw. The ale was thick, bitter, and strong. Robert emptied half his tankard in a single, sustained gulp, slamming it back onto the table with a satisfied sigh. He wiped the foam from his black beard, looking around the spacious, well-lit quarterdeck. I have to admit, Ned, you know how to build a ship, Robert said, running a heavy hand over the polished oak of the table. This vessel is a fortress. And the men, your northern marines do not fight like sailors. They fight like cornered boars. I watched them hold the line at the gates. They didn't yield an inch. The north is hard, Robert. It breeds hard men, Ned replied smoothly. He did not mention the grueling, relentless drills, the conditioning, or the heavy, floating armor he had designed. He simply let Robert believe it was the natural superiority of the northern blood. Robert grunted in agreement. He looked over at Benjen and Daisy, who had abandoned their knife throwing to watch the king. So, young pup, Robert called out to Benjen, pointing a thick finger at him. Ned tells me you are the new lord of Sea Dragon Point. A new keep for a new lord. And we are finally sailing to see you marry the she-bear. Benjen stood taller, puffing out his chest slightly under the king's scrutiny. We are. The moment we land, we will say our vows before the heart tree. Robert let out a booming laugh, looking at Daisy. You are a brave lad. I have seen the women of Bear Island fight. They are fiercer than half the knights in the Reach. Are you sure you can handle her? Daisy stepped forward, resting a hand casually on the hilt of her mace, a wicked, challenging grin on her face. He handles himself well enough. Though I occasionally have to remind him which end of the sword is the sharp one. Benjen flushed a deep, bright red, crossing his arms defensively. I do not. Robert howled with laughter, slapping the table again. Oh, he has the stark blush. Ned used to do the exact same thing whenever John Arryn brought the highborn ladies to the Eyrie for feasts. You would think a pretty girl was a drawn sword the way you Starks react. Ned smiled wryly, taking another sip of his ale. We prefer to save our courage for the battlefield, Robert. Nonsense, Robert declared, refilling his tankard to the brim. A man must have courage in all things. War, wine, and women. That is the measure of a true king. He leaned back, looking at Ned with a sudden, mischievous glint in his eye. The boredom of the sea voyage was clearly gnawing at him, and the king was desperately searching for entertainment. We need a contest, Ned, Robert announced loudly. We cannot simply sit here drinking ale like old men waiting for the winter to end. I am restless. If you wish to spar, Robert, I can have the master-at-arms bring up the padded blunted swords, Ned offered politely, though he knew perfectly well Robert had no interest in practicing forms. Sparring, bah, Robert waved a hand, my ribs are still wrapped tight, and I have no desire to bruise them further against your northern oak. No, I mean a proper contest. A test of skill and fortitude. Robert narrowed his eyes, a familiar, competitive fire burning in them. They told me back in Winterfell that you had to invent new games to keep your savage bannermen from killing each other during the feasts. Games of drinking and precision. Ned let out a slow, deliberate breath. He knew exactly where this was going. I did. The northern lords are competitive. They require an outlet when they drink. Show me, Robert demanded, leaning forward eagerly. Show me one of these northern games. I want to see how the wolves pass the time when they aren't brooding in the dark. Ned looked at his old friend. He saw the genuine, desperate need for distraction, the desire to shed the heavy, suffocating mantle of the crown for just one night and return to the simple brotherhood they had shared as wards in the Vale. Ned set his tankard down. A faint, wolfish smirk touched the corners of his mouth. Very well, Robert, Ned said, his voice dropping into a smooth, challenging cadence. If you wish to learn the ways of the North, I will teach you. But be warned, the games we play are not for men who lack a delicate touch. Robert scoffed loudly, flexing his massive right arm. I wield a warhammer that weighs more than your youngest brother, Ned. I think my touch is firm enough. Firmness is not the goal, Ned corrected. He stood up and gestured to Benjen. Ben, clear the table, bring 6 clean wooden cups from the galley, and a fresh bottle of winter's breath. Benjen's eyes lit up with sudden, eager recognition. You are playing the drunken squid. We are, Ned confirmed. Robert looked intrigued. The drunken squid, what kind of name is that? It is a game of angles, Robert, Ned explained, waiting as Benjen and Daisy quickly cleared the maps and the ale cask from the heavy oak table. And a game of endurance. Benjen returned moments later, carrying 6 polished wooden drinking cups and one of the heavy, square glass bottles of the clear northern spirits. He set them down. Ned took the cups. He arranged 3 of them in a tight triangle at the far edge of the table, directly in front of Robert's seat. He then walked to the opposite end, where his own chair sat, and arranged the remaining 3 cups in an identical triangle. He unstoppered the bottle of winter's breath. The sharp, clean scent of the high-proof spirit immediately cut through the smell of the sea air. Ned carefully filled all 6 cups to the brim with the clear, fiery liquid. The rules are simple, Ned instructed, pulling a single silver stag from his pouch. He held the coin up, the moonlight catching the stamped face of the king. We take turns, Ned continued, his voice calm and instructional. You stand at your end of the table. You must throw the coin. But you cannot simply toss it into the cups. The coin must strike the wood of the table first, bounce, and land inside one of my 3 cups. Robert stared at the small silver coin, then at the cups arranged nearly 6 feet away. You want me to bounce a coin into a cup of liquor? Exactly, Ned nodded. If your coin lands in my cup, I must drink the contents of that cup, and the cup is removed from the table. If you miss, nothing happens, and it becomes my turn. The first man to eliminate all 3 of his opponent's cups wins the game. Robert looked completely baffled. This is a game for children tossing pebbles into a puddle. You want me, the king of the 7 kingdoms, to play a game of bouncing coins? It requires absolute precision, Robert, Ned said, tossing the silver stag onto the table so it slid directly to Robert's hand. It requires you to judge the weight of the silver, the hardness of the wood, and the arc of the bounce. It is a test of a warrior's eye. Or, Ned allowed his smirk to widen into a teasing grin. Perhaps it requires too much finesse for a man accustomed to simply smashing things with a heavy hammer. Robert's jaw tightened. The bait was laid perfectly, and the stag took it entirely. Is that a challenge, Lord Stark? Robert growled, his competitive spirit flaring instantly. He picked up the silver stag, feeling its light weight in his massive, calloused palm. It is an invitation, Robert, Ned replied smoothly, taking his place behind his triangle of cups. To see if the stag has a light step, or just heavy hooves. I will show you heavy hooves, Robert declared, standing up and rolling his broad shoulders. He glared down the length of the table at Ned's cups. Daisy Mormont leaned against the mainmast, a wide, wicked grin splitting her face. 50 silver stags on Lord Stark, she announced loudly. Robert scoffed, not taking his eyes off the cups. You have little faith in your king, Lady Mormont. I have immense faith in your hammer, your grace, Daisy countered smoothly. But I've seen you try to pour a cup of wine without spilling half the cask. Finesse isn't exactly your strong suit. I'll take the wolf's odds. Robert barked a laugh. You're on, she-bear. But when I win, you owe me a dance at your wedding. I won't take that bet, Benjen laughed, shaking his head. I've seen Ned play this with the Greetjon. The Greetjon ended up sleeping on the floor of the Great Hall for 2 days. Do not count me out, you insolent pups. Robert barked, aiming a playful glare at the young couple. I have the best eye in the Stormlands. I can hit a running boar with a spear from horseback. A cup of water will be no challenge. Robert squared his shoulders. He held the silver coin between his thick thumb and forefinger. He leaned over the table, squinting, his tongue sticking out slightly in intense concentration. He looked like a massive, armored bear trying to pick a single berry off a bush. Watch and learn, Ned, Robert boasted. He threw the coin. He threw it with the force of a siege engine. The silver stag struck the heavy oak table with a deafening crack, leaving a visible dent in the wood. It ricocheted violently upward, hit the mainmast, bounced off a startled sailor's helmet, and vanished into the dark waters of the Sunset Sea. A moment of silence settled over the quarterdeck. Ned stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the edge of the table. He looked at the empty space where the coin had flown, then looked back at Robert. A powerful throw, Robert, Ned noted dryly, his voice perfectly flat. The drowned god thanks you for your generous contribution of 1 silver stag. Benjen and Daisy burst into uncontrollable laughter, clutching their sides. Robert's face flushed a deep, vibrant purple. He slammed his hand against his thigh, cursing loudly. Damn the wind, a gust caught it, give me another coin. Ned calmly withdrew another silver stag from his pouch and slid it across the smooth wood. It is my turn, Robert. The rules apply equally. Ned picked up the coin. He did not boast. He did not square his shoulders. He simply stood with the perfect, centered posture he utilized in the training yard. He reached out, not with magic, but with the profound spatial awareness he had cultivated over years of disciplined focus. He felt the subtle rocking of the winter's wrath beneath his boots, timing the sway of the deck. He pinched the coin lightly. With a smooth, effortless flick of his wrist, he tossed it. The silver stag hit the table exactly 2 feet in front of Robert's cups. It made a sharp tink, bounced in a perfect, shallow arc, and landed squarely in the center cup with a soft plop. Robert stared at the cup, his mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. He looked at Ned, who was standing with a perfectly neutral expression. That was luck, Robert grumbled, his pride deeply wounded. Perhaps, Ned agreed mildly, gesturing to the cup. Drink, Robert. Robert scowled, grabbing the wooden cup. He threw his head back and downed the winter's breath in a single, angry gulp. The high-proof vodka hit the back of his throat like a lit torch. Robert gasped, his eyes watering instantly. He opened his mouth to boast about how smooth it was, but instead, a ragged, wheezing cough escaped, followed by a visible puff of alcohol vapor in the freezing air. Gods, Robert croaked, pounding his massive chest. Did you distill a dragon? It strips the breath right out of you. It warms the blood, Ned said, retrieving the coin from the empty cup. He tossed it back to Robert. Your turn, your grace. Robert wiped his mouth, his eyes narrowing with fierce determination. He was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He studied the table again. He realized his error. It was not about strength, it was about the angle. He threw the coin again, much softer this time. The coin hit the table, bounced, and struck the rim of Ned's left cup, spinning wildly before rattling off the edge of the table and onto the deck. Closer, Ned offered encouragingly. Do not patronize me, Stark, Robert warned, retrieving the coin from the floorboards. The game continued. It became a rhythm of sharp clinks, bouncing silver, and the harsh, burning swallows of northern spirits. Robert was a quick study. On his 4th attempt, he managed to land a perfectly judged bounce directly into Ned's right cup. Ha! Robert roared, throwing his arms into the air in a victorious salute. The stag strikes. Drink, you frozen statue. Drink it down. Ned smiled, picking up the cup. He did not wince or gasp as he swallowed the drink. His internal discipline, the quiet regulation of his breathing, allowed him to process the harsh alcohol with remarkable ease. He set the empty cup aside. A fine throw, Robert, Ned praised genuinely. You have the measure of it now. As the game progressed and the level of alcohol in their bloodlines began to rise, the formality of the War Council entirely vanished. They ceased being the king and the warden of the North, reverting entirely to the two wild boys who had been fostered under John Aaron's stern, exasperated watch. The stakes of the game naturally escalated, not in gold, but in stories. I remember, Robert laughed, leaning heavily against the table, his words beginning to slur slightly as he lined up his next shot. I remember the feast at Gulltown. You spent the entire night staring into your cup of watered wine because you were absolutely terrified of Lord Grafton's daughter. She was not terrifying, Robert, Ned defended himself, a slight flush rising to his cheeks that had nothing to do with the vodka. She was simply, intensely focused. She asked me 3 times if the snows in Winterfell truly reached the height of a man's waist. I ran out of ways to say, yes. You were frozen solid, Robert howled, releasing the coin. It bounced beautifully, sinking into Ned's second cup. Drink to your shyness. Ned shook his head, downing the fiery liquid. He wiped his mouth, his own eyes beginning to shine with the pleasant, blurry warmth of the alcohol. He picked up the coin. And I remember, Ned countered, pointing the silver stag at Robert, the time you tried to sneak out of the Eyrie to visit that blacksmith's daughter in the Moon Gates. You attempted to climb down the winch basket chain in the dead of night. Benjen and Daisy leaned in closer, thoroughly captivated by the blackmail material being freely offered by the most powerful men in the realm. That was a brilliant plan, Robert argued defensively, waving a thick hand. It was a brilliant plan, Ned agreed, aiming his throw carefully, until John Arryn found you dangling halfway down the mountain, screaming that the wind was going to blow your breeches off. Ned flicked his wrist. The coin bounced, clipping the rim and dropping directly into Robert's second cup. Robert groaned loudly, clutching his face in his hands as Benjen and Daisy roared with laughter. John Arryn never let me forget that, Robert grumbled, picking up the cup of vodka and grimacing before throwing it back. He made me polish the armory for a week as punishment. The game had reached its climax. The tension was palpable. On the heavy oak table, only 2 cups remained. One in front of Ned, and one in front of Robert. The score was tied, sudden death. Robert stood up straight, rolling his shoulders, trying to blink the heavy, swirling fog of the winter's breath from his eyes. He looked at the single wooden cup standing proudly at Ned's end of the table. "This is it, Ned," Robert declared, his voice a low, dramatic rumble, swaying slightly on his feet. "The final strike. The fate of the realm rests upon this single silver stag." "It is a heavy burden, Robert," Ned agreed, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table, watching his friend with deep, abiding affection. "Try not to throw it into the sea this time." "I am the king," Robert boasted, raising the coin. "I do not miss twice." Robert focused entirely on the cup. He ignored the rocking of the ship, the sound of the wind in the lateen sails, the laughter of the young couple beside them. He channeled every ounce of his warrior's instinct into his massive hand. He threw the coin. It was a beautiful, terrible throw. It possessed too much speed, but the angle was flawless. The silver stag hit the table hard, launched upward in a steep arc, and slammed directly into the inner rim of Ned's final cup. The coin spun wildly around the lip of the wood. It rattled, a high, desperate sound, teetering on the very edge of falling out onto the table. Robert held his breath, leaning forward so far he nearly fell over the table. Ned watched the spinning silver intently. For a fraction of a second, Ned felt the temptation. A tiny, microscopic push of the force. A gentle nudge of air to knock the coin out and secure his victory. It would be so easy. But Ned looked at Robert. He saw the desperate, boyish hope in his friend's bloodshot eyes. He saw the man who had lost the woman he loved, the man who hated the throne he sat upon, finding a single moment of pure, unadulterated joy in a stupid game of bouncing coins. Ned smiled, and he completely released his hold on the energy around him. He let the laws of the world take their natural course. The spinning coin lost its momentum. It dropped inward, landing at the bottom of the cup with a definitive, ringing clink. Yes, Robert Baratheon's roar was so loud it likely woke the sailors in the lower decks. He threw his arms wide, looking to the heavens, performing a clumsy, triumphant jig in the center of the quarterdeck. "The stag prevails," Robert bellowed, pointing a victorious finger at Ned. "I told you, Stark. I have the best eye in the 7 kingdoms. Drink your defeat, drink it." Daisy Mormont clapped loudly, cheering the king's victory, while Benjen shook his head in absolute amusement. Ned chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that echoed the joy in the air. He reached forward, picking up the final cup of winter's breath. He stood up, raising the cup toward his oldest, dearest friend. To the victor, Ned toasted softly, his gray eyes shining with brotherhood. To the demon of the trident, and the champion of the drunken squid. Damn right, Robert cheered, picking up the empty bottle and waving it around. Ned drank the final cup, letting the fire burn down his throat. He set the cup down gently. The game was over. The laughter slowly subsided, replaced by the quiet, steady rushing of the wind and the crashing of the waves against the heavy hull of the carrack. Robert walked around the table, his steps heavy and slightly uncoordinated. He leaned his massive forearms against the wooden rail of the ship, staring out into the dark, churning expanse of the sunset sea. Ned walked over and joined him, resting his own hands on the rail. The cold air felt good against his flushed face. They stood in silence for a long time, the alcohol humming pleasantly in their veins, two brothers standing on the edge of the world. Tomorrow, Robert said quietly, his voice losing the boisterous edge, turning solemn and serious as he looked toward the northern horizon. Tomorrow we reach Sea Dragon Point. We do, Ned confirmed, looking out into the same darkness. We burned his fleet to ash, Ned, Robert murmured, the warrior returning to the forefront of his mind, speaking of their recent victory. We broke down his gates, and we made Balin Greyjoy kneel in the mud and beg for his miserable life. He knelt, Ned agreed, his voice hard as iron, feeling the steady, grounded energy of his northern discipline returning to wash away the fog of the drink. And the realm is safe. Robert smiled, a slow, tired expression. He clapped Ned on the shoulder one last time, a heavy, reassuring weight. Good, Robert grunted. He turned away from the rail and took a step toward the stairwell. His leg immediately buckled, the world spinning as the drink finally laid siege to his balance. Without a word, Robert reached down, grabbed his massive iron warhammer, and planted the head on the deck with a heavy thud. Leaning heavily on the weapon of legendary destruction as if it were an old man's walking stick, the king of the Seven Kingdoms carefully hobbled his way into the shadows. Now, I need to sleep before my head splits open, Robert mumbled as he limped away. If I am going to drink your keep dry and dance at a wedding tomorrow, I cannot be seeing 3 of every Northman. Rest well, your grace, Ned called after him, hiding a grin. And you, Lord Stark, Robert called back over his shoulder, disappearing into the darkness of the lower deck. Ned chuckled quietly, turning back to face the sea. The war was finished. The laughter had returned. Tomorrow, they would celebrate the pack at the shores of Sea Dragon Point. To be continued.